Srdačan pozdrav, dragi gledatelji. Evo, nalazimo se na Fakultetu filozofije i religijskih znanosti. Govorimo ispred Centra za proučavanje odnosa, znanosti i religije, koja je podružnica spomenutog fakulteta, a sve to u sklopu Sveučilišta u Zagrebu. Fakultet je usmjeren ka uspostavljanju jednog funkcionalnog dijaloga između razuma i vjere. Dakle, mi smo akademska platforma za proučavanje, filozofsku analizu, filozofsko promišljanje o odnosima znanosti i religije. Nismo aktivisti, nikakvi, niti kršćanski, politički, društveni, bilo kakvi nismo aktivisti i nismo ekumenska inicijativa. Ovo evo neka bude prvi podcast ispred Centra za proučavanje odnosa znanosti i religije, koje ćete moći pratiti na našim stranicama preko našeg YouTube kanala. Večeras imam čast pozdraviti uvaženog gosta sa Sveučilišta u Edinburghu. Now I will switch to English. So today, whatever this is podcast, it could be any time of the day. Now at this wonderful moment, I have this pleasure to present to you, to give you Revd Canon Dr. Michaela Fullera. He is a member of the University of Edinburgh at Divinity School there. And he is a leading expert on the questions on the philosophy of a relationship between science and religion. Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay. So let's start easy. We're going to go through some subjects over time of approximately 30 minutes. We are not going to bother our watchers. So let's, can you position current situation in the philosophy of relationship between science and religion?
Yes, thank you. I think there are various strands to contemporary thinking that have emerged in the last 10 years, 20 years. When the study of science and religion first became a thing, largely following the work of Ian Barber and his successors, there was a particular kind of understanding that was built into what was meant by science and what was meant by religion. So one of the things that's been an important factor in recent explorations has been the recognition that there's actually rather more to it than was encompassed by those original assumptions. So Barber, coming from where he was coming, thought of religion primarily in terms of the kind of Western Christian Protestantism, which he was a part. And there was a kind of veiled, not explicit assumption that this stood and was typical of religion more generally. And similarly, he thought about science in terms of the physical sciences, and with the assumption, which actually many scientists may to some extent share, that physical science is the classic science, and others are aspiring to the kinds of conditions of physical science. So one very important strand of recent work has been the realization that there are limits to these assumptions, that science isn't a monolithic thing, that religion isn't a monolithic thing, that there are various expressions of science, there are various expressions of religion, which are only imperfectly captured by the kind of ways in which Barber analyzed them. So that's been a very important realization too in recent studies. Another very important aspect has been generated by the work of historians, and I'm thinking here particularly of people like John Hedley Brooke and Peter Harrison, who've looked at the ways in which science and religion have related in the past and demonstrated that there's a great deal of complexity in those relations. They're not monolithic kinds of things where you've got science championing one thing and religion championing another. There's often a lot more complex interplay between them, governed by personal, sociological, political factors. Harrison has also made a very interesting investigation of the way in which those words, science and religion, in the English language, have come to have the contours they do and have come to be seen as oppositional to one another. Through the development of the original Latin terms, religio, scientia, which were very different in meaning to our modern words, science and religion. So that's been, again, a very interesting and important piece of work, I think, that's come out of the thinking of historians. So the general tendency has been to recognize a great deal more complexity in the relationships between sciences and religions, And certainly an outright rejecting, really, of the conflict idea that's been so current in popular thinking. I think there are very few now in the academy who would still espouse that kind of model.
Yeah, this is my impression too, but I don't want to guide my my viewers and people who may follow the public activity of the center. That's why I will gladly let you speak more than me. Of course, Ian Barbour, who was actually the founding father of the field, he was tremendously important for the field, and this is a very young field, even from the 60s of the last century, and he is developing fast, I would say. How would you see his initial models today? They are obviously developing, but kind of, this is my impression, they're not stretching beyond what he laid down. This is my impression. Maybe I'm wrong.
I think there's still been, well, those models still have a lot of work being done on them. He was keen to stress things like a comparable methodology in what he terms science and religion. Here he's talking more about Christian Protestant theology.
Yes.
And there's been a lot of work developing that. There's been recent work also rejecting that idea that methodological comparisons are apt or appropriate. And certainly, I mean, he had particular aims in mind. He's trying to overcome the idea that science and religion are very, very different. He's saying, no, they have these commonalities. And perhaps he went a bit too far, or perhaps he constrained thinking about what science and religion are in order to emphasize those commonalities as he saw them. And this was a very important project at the time, I think, and did a huge amount to overcome this conflict kind of perception. And he drew attention, his followers drew attention to other ways in which scientists and theologians may have parallels in the way they think, for example, about the nature of reality, the idea that both espouse a form of critical realism, for example. And again, that's been much critiqued latterly too, but these were important stages, I think, in the development of a true dialogue between science and religion that encompasses as much as possible about those two ideas.
But now, my impression would be that his first model, first idea, I mean, of course, he produced several ways how science and religion might mutually interact, but the first one was set on the conflict. So my impression is now that at least one very important part of the academic community is kind of rejecting this idea that they're in constant conflict. Of course, we had some conflicts in the past, but I think they're kind of rejecting this idea. What do you think about it?
Yes, I think that's very true. And I think that's partly the work of the historians I've been talking about, who've drawn attention to the complexity of what was going on. A lot of the conflict myth stems from the thinkers in the latter part of the 19th century.
Yes.
And some of that thinking is tied to ideas around, in the UK context, around the ideas of Charles Darwin. So in fact, the reception of Darwin's ideas in the English-speaking world is very complex. There were theologians who applauded him and as revealing something new about God, about the immanence of God in creation. Aubrey Moore wrote in those sorts of terms. As well as some who had problems with his ideas. There were some scientists who had problems with his ideas. This is supposed to be an empirically founded idea, evolution. Where's the evidence?
Exactly. I will interrupt you shortly here, since I'm a biology geneticist. One was a Scottish gentleman, Jenkins, who said, you don't have mechanism to produce biodiversity, and indeed he didn't have that time because we didn't know genetics.
That's right.
Mendelian genetics was not around. Okay, go ahead, please.
Yeah, that's what's right. And in the same way, people who are saying where's the evidence didn't have access to the fossil record that we now have, where such evidence can be adduced. So the situation there, that was one. But there were other more polemical aspects to this as well, to people talking up a conflict. One much commented upon area in the UK has been surrounding the idea of the professionalisation of science. And one of Darwin's disciples, Thomas Henry Huxley, is particularly pointed out in this context. Insofar as science was practiced in the UK prior to the mid and late 19th century, it was largely a preserve of gentlemen amateurs. There was no profession of scientist. Many of these were members of the clergy. They had time to spend in their parish duties of exploring the natural world, for example, that they found themselves in. So part of the broader social context, if you like, behind these debates has been seen to try to drive a wedge between scientific practitioners, professional scientific practitioners, and gentlemen amateurs like members of the clergy. So there was a science-religion kind of divide. Plus there was the idea too that the dominance of clergy in many of the learned societies at the time led to scientific findings being presented in ways that were consonant with Christian belief. And some thinkers thought, well, that shouldn't be necessary. We shouldn't have to present science in these sorts of terms. Scientific findings, they have their own merit regardless of what they say about the divinely ordered world or whatever.
Of course.
So that was all part of it as well. There were two very big books that came out of North America, one by Andrew Dixon White and by John William Draper, I think it's John William Draper, which pumped up this idea of conflict between science and religion. But it's long been recognised that they were retrofitting this idea of conflict into historical.
This is my idea too. This is my impression also.
Yeah. And in ways which historians have said, well, this is patently unhistorical. They're not being faithful to the historical record in presenting this deep-set conflict in history. It's not there.
So now that leads us to the idea of the late Jay Gould, who would say perhaps we should look them as a non-overlapping magisteria. And I remember myself at the beginning of my studying years, I'm a biologist. As I repeat, I am very much fond of the general mechanism in biology, which is evolution, and it's evident, it's obvious. Another question is how should we scale it up, scale it down when we talk about micro and macro evolution, and where is the experimental possibility to check the macro evolution. This is another story. But I was also fond of the idea, okay, perhaps they are not overlapping magisteria, since I was fond of my religious part of me and my scientific part of me. But now, in these days, I am also rejecting the idea of no overlapping. Obviously, they overlap. What do you think?
Yes, I think it's a way. And I think the way Stephen Jay Gould viewed it is a way of keeping the peace. It's a pragmatic thing.
That was a pragmatic, exactly. That was a pragmatic way.
It's a way of saying each is important. Each has its own set of things to contribute to human life and human understanding. And it's a way of keeping the peace between them. And that idea of non-overlapping magisteria has been developed in various ways by various thinkers, and not always convincingly, I think, to say that, for example, science is about facts and religion is about what they mean. And I think that one has to be careful with too hasty generalizations around this. So I'm inclined to agree with you that I think the problem with the independence model of Barber is that whilst on the one hand it has a certain practical efficacy, it cuts off some aspects of the interaction of science and religion, which I think can profitably be explored. And I think a religious perspective that just said, we don't need to think about science at all, that's something completely different, I think that would be problematic. I think it would be a diminished. I think it would be a diminished.
Yes, I agree.
Perspective. Yeah,
I agree. Now we'll. Shortly, for the sake of the argument, we'll skip his third idea on the dialogue, which is I'm the fan of this idea. We'll straightly go to his last supposition, that integration. So this is some idea that, in my view, as a professional scientist, bears actually potential problems. It's integrating something that is at least aims to be epistemically fully justifiable, like science, and that is something that relies on faith that cannot be epistemically justified, and trying to integrate that seems to me a bit of a problem. I would like to hear you.
Yes. And I think this in part goes back to, I think there are two aspects to this. It in part goes back to what we were saying earlier about Barber's models for science and religion and his ways of trying to find parallels, methodological parallels between them, for example. So he would urge that these parallels make it possible to form an integration of the two, making what he referred to as an inclusive metaphysics. But I think part of the direction of science and religion studies since then has been to say, well, science and religion aren't best thought of in the ways that he did. They're actually much bigger, more amorphous kinds of ideas. So relating, to use a metaphor that was used in a different context, relating science and religion is about relating envy and my left foot. This is Terry Wilton's comment.
Yes.
They're just completely different things.
Yes.
And they're very big, they're very amorphous. There may be some overlap in certain ways,
yes.
and Barber was charting those kinds of overlaps very effectively. But to see them as possibly being fully integrated, I think is it's not really possible. They're just so different in terms of what they're are trying to do. And I think part of, as I say, recent studies has been to stress that that difference, the bigger than Barber kind of aspects of both science and religion. And related to that has been the recognition, this goes back some years now to people like John Polkinghorne,
Yes.
that what both science and religion do is have a particular way of thinking about phenomena, religious or scientific phenomena, which is conceived within a particular framework. So a danger around integration would be to say, well, we're going to adopt a scientific kind of framework for understanding the world, and we're going to make religion fit into that. And that's kind of what Barber was doing. Or the other way around, we could adopt a religious framework, and we can kind of fit science into that. And that's what more recent tendencies like science-engaged theology is tending to do. And what both of those run the risk of doing is only imperfectly capturing all the nuances of the other. So science is interpreted in religious terms, religion is interpreted in science terms. And Polkinghorne referred to this as assimilation.
Yes.
One of these is taken on board in ways that the other
Absolutely.
can fully analyse and comprehend. And that does violence to whichever one is being assimilated.
I agree. It definitely, there is a great space for damaging both areas, and we don't want that, definitely. Of course, there are thinkers in the Lutheran world, particularly from Sweden, Stenmark and others, that would say, why shouldn't we believe in science instead of religion? And that is really dangerous thought, I would say. I mean, science is not something that you believe in. If you have a full epistemic justification, then you have episteme knowledge. Why should you believe in something that you know? I mean, yeah.
Yes, in a sense, to make or to insist upon science as a matter of belief is to. Some critics would say, well, that's to make it into a religion, effectively.
Exactly,
a new kind of religion, which obviously has problems, and which many, I think, coming from a scientific position, we want to resist.
Exactly, me too. I'm the first one. Thank you for this. Now we're going to. I don't want this first session to be overstretched, because I want it to be rather shorter so people can see it. Let's go toward closing. Let's talk about this model of Ian Barbour that talks about dialogue. In my perspective, that would be constant dialogue that actually happened a long time ago and lasts today, and it will last. I would say a long time at the end of the days. But perhaps I'm biased. He is here because I'm fond of this model. What do you think?
Yes, well, I very much come from that kind of background too. I was actually taught by John Polkinghorne.
That's a privilege.
Yes, in Cambridge, and this was very much his approach. He was very much a fan of this dialogue idea, and he taught a course in Cambridge that was called the Dialogue of Science and Religion. And of Barbour's four categories, it would be the one that I most favour to, though I think it's worth recognising that others have expanded and developed that category, those four categories, and made more subtle and more carefully nuanced understandings. So I think there's a limit to what dialogue can achieve, because again, dialogue tends to be conducted on the basis of a set of assumptions from either scientific or religious perspectives. And the tendency has always been for, in classic science and religion studies, for that basis to be a scientific basis. So one, I think, very apt criticism of the dialogue model is that it's a very one-way dialogue. It's about theology exploring what it can glean from scientific perspectives.
I can agree that too.
And much less the other way around.
Yes.
Though it might be argued that insofar as ethical concerns fall under what Gould would call the magisterium of religion, the precise relationship between ethics and religion, of course, is complex and convoluted. But there, insofar as ethical concerns place constraints around science, that there's perhaps merit in the scientific side of the debate engaging with that in order better to understand the kind of constraints that it's operating within.
Obviously, this debate, of course, we are now discussing very important stuff, actually very hard ideas in a very small amount of time. But I think we covered it well enough. Would you have to say something to our audience, to offer them something to...
Well, I've just come straight from giving a lecture to some of the students here, looking at some work of my own in the field of big data and theology and the analysis of big data. And I think there's some important aspects of that impinge on the conversation we've been having. First, one aspect of recent science and religion study has been the broadening out of the terms beyond those which Barbara originally conceived them in, encompassing, for example, more than just the physical sciences. So social science, biological science have been part of that. And this, my own interest in big data, can be considered as a part of that broadening out tendency, because the idea of data, the modern idea of data science is a new way of thinking about how science and theology can interrelate. And the other is that I think here, my personal view is that there are possibilities here for that dialogue to become genuinely two-way. Because one of the big concerns around data science is the ethics around the algorithmic manipulation of data and the concerns that biases may be built into those analyses and may bring about various kinds of social injustice.
Exactly.
And it seems to me that theologians and philosophers who have invested heavily in the development of hermeneutics have something very important to say here, because statistics, numbers, are often supposed to be that they're just there. They just are.
It's data.
Yeah, data. It's just there. But of course it's not just there. It's gathered in particular ways which may embody particular biases. It's analysed in ways which might embody particular biases. And so the kind of hermeneutical tools that have been brought in by theologians in the analysis of sacred texts are relevant here, I think, in terms of their potential applicability to data science. And indeed, people like Gadamer have acknowledged that statistics requires a hermeneutical approach. Yeah.
Methodologically, this is really good.
Yes.
Promising.
I hope so. So I think there are potentialities there, I think, about the dialogue generally being developed in a two-way fashion around this particular area. Yeah.
Nice. So I will offer a short conclusion. So we are pretty good having modern scientific method and methodology in building knowledge. And from religion, we have ways to find wisdom. Connecting those is something that we, in the realm of the dialogue, this is my dream.
Yes. That notion of wisdom is very helpful, I think, in indicating just the way in which different categories, different ways of knowing and of embodying knowledge are stressed within different traditions. Celia Dean Drummond, for example, has written about wisdom in this kind of context. It's one of the themes that are being explored in the kind of science-engaged theology that I mentioned. I think this is very, very helpful. Wisdom, what exactly we mean by wisdom is, of course, a contested term again, but if we're thinking about it in terms of the apt or right use of knowledge,
yes,
that perhaps, again, introduces a perspective on knowledge that isn't necessarily something that is generatable from purely scientific perspectives. We need to look elsewhere.
Yeah, I agree. So let's close it up, wrap it up with a simple sentence. Fear of God is the start of each of wisdom. Yeah?
Yes.
This is, okay. Dragi gledatelji, dragi pratitelji našeg podcasta, evo, zahvaljujem što ste gledali. Dear Michael, thank you for this nice session.
My pleasure.
Pratite nas i dalje. Evo, neka ovaj za početak ovo bude ovako kratko, ali slatko. Nadam se da će tako i vama biti. Hvala lijepo. I zahvalio bi, vi što sam zaboravio, zahvalio bi našem tehničaru bez kojeg ovo ne bi bilo moguće.